Hello, hello everyone. Hello, hello. Thank you guys so much for joining. I'm going to... Hi, Steph. I'm going to paste this. Pin comment. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Good to see you. Let me just wave. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. We're just going to, I hopped on a little bit early. I'm gonna wait for Vinay to hop on. I'm gonna wave at everyone. Hi. Good to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Super excited for this conversation. I'm going to pause this. Beautiful music. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be with you today in conversation. We will have a very special guest joining us today. I'm going to continue to wave at people as they trickle in. We're going to have the one and only Vinay Harrichan from the Cutlass. I'm so excited to have a conversation with him. We're going to discuss Indo-Caribbean identity and culture. Let me know if you can hear me. I should have probably checked before I started talking, but yeah, let me know. So we'll be in conversation with Vinay. He is one of my favorite Instagram accounts. I'm not allowed to have favorites, but it's one of my favorites. Every time I read a post from Vinay, I feel like I get a little bit wiser. I get a little bit more rooted in culture, and so I'm super grateful for the Cutlass, and also Vinay has a podcast in case you haven't listened to that as well. So while we get Vinay to join us, I'm going to try to see if I can find you, and I'll go through and sort of share with you the genesis of this conversation, and we'll get Vinay on. Hopefully that works. Send request. There you are.
Can you can hear and see me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you. You can hear me, right?
I can hear you.
Okay, let me try to see. Can I move these comments so I can see your face, or no? Is that not possible? Let's see.
Stuff like
Wave, wave, wave. Okay. You kind of broke up there, Vinay.
okay.
Oh my gosh, I can't see your face. How do I stop this? Okay. All right, we'll figure it out. It's fine. Okay. Vinay, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to see you. It's good to be in conversation with you. I was just sharing with everyone else how much I love the Cutlass, and how special it is to me, because I feel so rooted every time I read one of your posts, and it takes me to a place. So thank you so much for everything that you post, and we are all in such gratitude for the work that you do. So thank you. I just want to share that right off the bat.
Thank you. I appreciate those. Very good.
Thank you. So the genesis, I'll share the genesis of this conversation actually. So in case you haven't seen Two Times Removed, this is a book curated by Tiara J. Chokan, also Bookworm Babe. It's a collection of 16 Indo-Caribbean fiction stories that highlight various themes of Indo-Caribbean culture and heritage, around maybe trauma, some of the specific struggles that we may go through as Indo-Caribbean people. And so I'm a contributor to this book, and I wrote a story called Karila. So it's really a story of love, resilience, and what's not too clear, and intentionally so, is that there's some symbolism behind it as well. And so it's a story capturing three generations. So the generation before us who would have migrated here to Canada or anywhere else around the world. The main plot is about a teenage girl just trying to navigate being Indo-Caribbean in the world. She's a teenager. And then it goes into her children. And so it spans between three generations. And I'm just going to wave because I see some people come in. And during the last part of the story, which is really beautiful in essence, is the main character, Celicia, she passes down a recipe book with all of these Indo-Caribbean recipes in it. And one of the her daughter goes through and recognizes most of the recipes, which is amazing. Of course, we want our children, hopefully in the future, to see all the amazing food that is Indo-Caribbean dishes. And she, the daughter actually doesn't recognize one of them, and that one is Karila. So in the story, you know that Celicia doesn't like Karila, and so she, obviously, when she decided to have children, she didn't cook it in her house. And so really it was this symbolic way of me sharing how I navigated some of the Indo-Caribbean identity that I personally struggled with growing up, which is luckily enough I was amongst Indo-Caribbean people, so I saw myself in others. I was amongst some of the traditions and some of the things that are great. I also saw some things that didn't mesh with me, and it didn't, especially as I grew older, it didn't really resonate too much for me. So I had to go through this process, Vinay, of sort of like letting go some of this stuff that I was seeing and I was hearing and I was internalizing. And so really in the story, it's this way of me saying, here's the collection of things that are Indo-Caribbean, and I'm going to for sure educate my child, educate whoever needs to be educated on it, but I don't cook it in my house, and I will not, have it a part of my identity. Yeah, so that was sort of how I navigated identity. That was a really long way of me introducing what we're talking about here. So I think one of the things I want to do before I get into the conversation, which I always forget, is to share a little bio about you first. So I have it somewhere, and I don't know, I think people would have to be under a rock to not know the Cutlass, but we're gonna tell everybody a little bit more about you. So Vinay is the founder and curator of the Cutlass, a progressive podcast and social media platform dedicated to the Indo-Caribbean community and descendants of Indian indentureship. He discusses culture, religion, politics, history, and entertainment through his posts, as well as his podcast, also with his podcast guests. Having taught himself his ancestral language, which is so cool, Vinay's independent research centers on documenting and revitalizing Hindustani among those living in the West Indies, in addition to the diaspora. His ongoing archival project consists of interviews with elders who still speak the language and have knowledge of old customs that are at risk of fading with time, as well as local cultural activists. So Vinay, thank you so much for sharing that bio with us. Before we get into conversation, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? I've been talking so much.
Well, I actually did get a chance to read your story. I would do the book here, but I'm actually using it as a stand to help me prop on.
It's sharing stories and very practical. What can I say?
Yeah, and I really enjoy it. I like the idea of kind of having to pass on a collection and allowing the subsequent generation to pick and choose, what they carry on. So I really like that kind of metaphor. So I thought I would let you know it's a really nice story.
Oh, thank you, Vinay.
In terms of information about me, I know that I'm not always very public in terms of being, the face of the platform, but I was born in Trinidad, and I moved up here when I was younger, South Florida, and I've just grown up here in South Florida with a relatively large Indo-Caribbean community here. So I was always very lucky to grow up with, puja stores and West Indian groceries and the local mandirs and our cultural centers and the roti shops and all of that. So I grew up with a really large community here, and I think that's probably why I held on to the identity as strong as I did and things like the accent. But yeah, no, I just kind of grew up here in South Florida. In terms of my background, this actually isn't my main line of work. I studied English and engineering in school. So that's kind of my main thing. This is really a passion project of mine that I started around when I was 17, and I'm 24 now, so it's been a pretty long time of, independent research, and I figured I would just get on here and share everything that I learned with people because I really wasn't too active on social media prior to that. So this is still kind of new to me. But we're actually approaching about 1 year of the Cutlass, I think August 17th or the 19th, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I'm very appreciative of everyone who's here watching and people who supported the page.
Amazing, thank you. And you know what? So many of the projects that we do are sort of on the side and sort of our way of indulging in our Indo-Caribbean culture and identity. And I think it's amazing that you take the time out of your, there's so many things you could be doing, Vinay, but you educate us and you do research and you do a lot of things that all of us don't necessarily want to do. So we thank you, and you make us a little bit smarter every time. So thank you so much. So going back to sort of this discussion around identity and the story around Corella, you did share that you did grow up with, a Indo-Caribbean community. And so I'm wondering from you, in terms of how you grew up and how would you describe your teenage years with identity?
I always say that one of the things I'm very lucky about is the fact that my parents never pressured us to assimilate. So if we spoke in an accent, they never told us to, talk properly or anything like that. They were always very undeniably proud of who they were and where they came from. So I never felt the need to be American or whatever someone's idea was of being American. So I'm always very grateful for that because I think that whether or not they were aware of it or not, they kind of passed down a sense of pride. So for me, I always knew about our culture and our history growing up just because I was privy to conversations, happening in my family about it and stories that my mom and dad would pass down. So I always knew about where we came from, and the history wasn't very substantial, but I definitely knew that, our ancestors came from India and they were indentured laborers and all of that stuff. And my parents are always very just direct about it. Like, I know a lot of people always bring up the census question of what box do you tick off? And I think my parents are always like, well, we're not white, we're not black, we're not Hispanic. And our ancestors are from India, which is in Asia, therefore we're Asian. So that was never even really something that I questioned because I guess they were very straightforward about it. So I never went through the identity crisis that I think a lot of people probably go through. And I think a lot of it has to do with also my personality when I was younger. I definitely had people who tried to bully me, say things about the culture or stuff about Indian people or be ignorant, but my kind of innate personality, I really didn't care. And I had a lot of friends who did care and they took it on and they tried to distance themselves from the community and the culture because of that. And I think that that's kind of the dominant narrative. Most people want to fit in and be accepted and be, seen as normal. Whereas that was never really a priority for me. So I didn't necessarily care if people were ignorant about, my family background and my history. I would say that it wasn't really until around the age of 17, as I mentioned before, when I decided to be actively involved in researching and learning more, because it was always there, I was always aware of it and practice it, but I never really made a conscious effort of, okay, I want to study this, I want to make it into something concrete, and I think that as a natural process of getting older, you start to think about, what you'll leave behind and what you'll pass on. And I think for me, the early death of both of my grandmothers, my nanny and my aji, really kind of put into focus for me how fleeting life is and how you really regret the questions you don't ask, and how people pass away and they take all of this history with them and you can never get it back. So I think their death when I was, 13 and 15, that really made me more aware of our background and wanting to actively preserve it. But I never denied it before that.
Hmm. So would you say you having this history, you being amongst your grandparents, sort of like was an inspiration for you to do all the work that you're doing right now and have that passion behind what you're doing?
I think it was more of because we moved here, the vast majority of my family is back home in Trinidad.
Mm.
It from them a lot, and our conversation would have to, kind of rely on their vacations here or us calling them and talking to them. And I think a lot of the regret that I had after they passed away about all the things that I never really asked. And obviously, I was very young. I was 13, 15. You're not really thinking about, culture and history at that age. So I think I was mourning the loss of them, but also the loss of their stories and us knowing them more. And I think that really drove me to now, especially with my archival project, talking to other elders and finding out their stories. I think maybe I'm making up for it in some regards there.
And I think that's something for all of us to take away, and anyone who's joining us today. I think I went through the same experience of losing an aunt, and I didn't get one of her recipes. And honestly, it's like, it's so, you don't realize you're not thinking about, their knowledge and what they have to share. And we benefit from all their amazing food and knowledge. And then one day you never know what can happen, right? So if it's one takeaway too, I think that I want to share on here is to kind of talk to our ancestors, talk to our grandparents, talk to our parents to see what we can save, because you never know what can happen.
Mhm.
So, given this fact that you were around Indo-Caribbean people, one of the conversations that we had amongst some of the writers in Two Times Removed is around these Corellas that we particularly associated or were stereotypical, whether we believed it or not, or whether we identified with it or not. Where we felt like there were these issues that were Corellas in how we perceive them anyway, that we didn't resonate with us. And some of the conversations were particularly around domestic violence. They were about how women have been treated traditionally within the community and within the culture. We did talk about assimilation, as you mentioned, which is Syra had mentioned that. Savita had mentioned a Corella around being hypersexualized by Asian men, particularly South Asian men. Tiara had mentioned, for example, just the long history of how they had come to the Caribbean, and some of the stories even before they arrived to the Caribbean. And so some of these are the Corellas that we had brought up, and I was watching and I was rewatching our conversation, and I was like, well, this is really from a very dominant female perspective. And so savoring the Indo-Caribbean being a shared, co-created space, I really wanted to hear from a male. And so given some of the things, I'm sure there are some you share in our pain, Vinay, some of these things that, Indo-Caribbean women have gone through. And I'm wondering from you, do you have any Corellas? Like, what would you say are some of the things that you may put down or have put down?
Yeah, whenever I think of the kind of major issues that I've encountered, whether it's as you mentioned, the domestic violence or the gender-based violence, or even issues like mental health, how that's not really regarded as being a thing. Or for me, a big one that I always encountered was alcoholism and the kind of way that fuels a lot of people in the community, and people don't really talk about it. Or even things like colorism. And for me, whenever I think about how I can tackle it or how I can have conversations about it, I always try and remind myself that these are not community-specific issues. It's not just the Indo-Caribbean community that struggles with colorism or mental health or gender-based violence. It's a global issue. But I
Mm-hmm.
try it through the lens that is kind of, what are culturally specific ways that we can tackle it? So mental health is a global issue, but how has it taken root in our community? And so I think about indentureship and the traumas of that, and how possibly me learning more about indentureship and seeing how it's tied to mental health, seeing how it's tied to alcoholism or violence, and trying to help people understand that. Because I think sometimes, I've met a lot of people who will say how they don't identify with the community, or they don't want to be a part of the community because of those issues. And so I try to remind them that it's not just us that we struggle with it, but we mainly interact a lot of times with people in our own community because of just the way I think our populations have kind of clustered around one another. So I always try to say that, everyone is tackling these issues and they're doing it in different ways, but it's not just our people that are struggling with it, but we can use, by learning our history, learning about the system of indentureship and how that fostered all of these issues, trying to tackle them that way. So they aren't insurmountable obstacles. We can correct them, we can tackle them, we can hopefully correct them or minimize them for the future generations. So I think, and I can't really think of anything that is Indo-Caribbean specific, other than sometimes I think a certain reticence to address the history. A lot of people think that, when you look back into the history of moving backwards, as they say, back to the cane fields, and they just want to, look forward. And I think perhaps that might be a response to the trauma of it all, or just wanting to move forward and not have to think about everything that happened back then. But I do feel that it's important to know what we came from and who we came from in order to carve out, the best possible future for ourselves. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I answered the question entirely, but yeah, those are kind of the issues I've come across.
And I think that's a really great point that you mentioned, which is some of these are global issues, and I think what's unique is the stories behind them. As you were talking about, the history of indentureship, and I was wondering from your research, you brought up alcoholism. So I'm wondering from your research, what do you know about alcoholism and how it sort of got intertwined with Indo-Caribbean identity in terms of, in terms of the men and how they gather and socialize. And
Well, one of the things that I've learned is that indentureship wasn't really a system that was intended to last forever. I don't really think that the British or the Dutch or the French really had a long-term goal or long-term plan. So they kind of just took all of these young, able-bodied men, many of whom were single, and they brought them to the Caribbean or Fiji or Mauritius. And they never really thought about family or family planning or community. And so what happened was you had this very huge overpopulation of men and a very small shortage of women, which ends up creating a whole bunch of issues. You have men struggling with mental illness who don't have partners, who've been separated from their family, who were told that they would go as, the sons in their home and become rich and bring it back to their family. That wasn't the case. And then you had the scarcity of women, so obviously you have people that are lacking partners. And then that creates competition, and then competition leads to violence, if we're talking about gender-based violence there. And then one of the ways that they coped a lot of times with the trauma of indentureship or the isolation or the loneliness and depression was drinking alcohol. Because oftentimes every kind of plantation, every village, very systematically had a rum shop located in all of them. And rum at the time would have been a very kind of cheap thrill, and it was what people could afford. And so it became very accessible and used as a coping mechanism. And then that obviously fosters alcoholism, depression, and it also leads to a lot of men, which people might not know, but a lot of that kind of first generation of men that came over for indentureship, there was a very high rate of suicide. And Caribbean people and Indian people in Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad continue to make up some of the highest percentages of suicides, which I think is kind of a generational holdover there, generational trauma that has been passed down. And you have these men who, as I mentioned, are separated from their family, now turning to alcohol as a coping for their depression or their loneliness, and then they're committing suicide to the point where in Trinidad they had a kind of fertilizer, or I think a rat poisoning, and they call that Indian tonic because it was just widely known that that was what Indian men would use to commit suicide. So when you
Mm-hmm.
think about just the degree to which people were committing suicide or dealing with these issues and not having any means at all to cope with them and not having their family with them, not having elders with them, they really just kind of had to do with whatever they had. And I think now you see many generations after, we're trying to kind of pick up the pieces there and try to understand where people are, where these issues have come from, and how we can use all of our access and all of our knowledge to correct them.
And I think one of the things I know about Guyana still has a really high suicide rate. It's one of the highest in the world, and the big portion of that is men, and a big portion of that is Indo-Caribbean men. And so what we're seeing still is still that resonance of mental health and lack of support to effectively curb the issue at hand, which is ultimately mental health. And so I think one of the things I think I want to say to any women or anyone joining here is that I know that there's one of the things that I've noticed just growing up is there are these perceptions we have of Indo-Caribbean men and who they are and what they do, and so we're very quick to sort of label and criticize. And so I can only speak from a woman's perspective. So what I can say is like what you've shared is something for all of us to remember and humanize men a little bit more, because I think we've, in the culture and in conversations that I've had, it's sort of like we just want to like cancel them. We just want to cancel the Caribbean men sometimes. And, it's like we have to remember some of the things that they've gone through. And of course, it's no excuse. Let
Mm-hmm.
me be clear. It's no excuse for what is continuing to happen, because we do have high rates of domestic violence. We do have very high rates of alcoholism. And I think one of the things that's important for me as I navigate the sphere right now is to give a little grace to some of the men, but also hold them accountable to what they now have access to. It's interesting because sometimes I see this, because I know a little bit of the history, I see it still playing out in some ways where back in those days, it must have been hard. It must have been difficult. You're working under these terrible conditions, backbreaking conditions, and just, it's terrible. And you're being violated during that time. You're being harassed, you're beaten. And then how else do you cope? Right? You're working for all these hours, and that is obviously going to be one of the ways in which you cope. In some ways, it can look like our men are still doing that, right? We have to, of course, acknowledge that coming to in the diaspora, it's not exactly easy. We're not back in the sugar canes, but it's not exactly easy either, right? Nothing is handed to us, and so there are things that stress us out. And as we become more educated, especially if you're in, for example, in Canada, where we provide free mental health for everyone here. I think it's incumbent upon all of us, men included, women included, to access those resources. And yeah, so that's what I would really wish for us, is to see how our history, as you mentioned, has affected some of the ways that we've been brought up. And of course, like, we know psychologically how men recreate their way of being by seeing their paternal fathers, and so it's really easy for us to continue cycles. And so hopefully there are some ways in which we can little by little kind of just break some of these. And I think we one of the ways women I'll speak from a woman's perspective, is to give a little grace to the men and support them in their journey through mental health, and of course hold them accountable for everything that they've hold them accountable for ways that they may not show up the way that they really should. Simone says another coping mechanism was exerting power and control over women, which is why GBV is such a huge issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, and they're also interrelated, aren't they? Some of these issues.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, like it's no excuse. And when you look at these statistics about domestic violence, alcoholism, rates of suicide, they're all pretty damning that these continue to be really, really huge problems in the community. And I think when you look at the history, that just is a way for, especially I think the younger generation of Indo-Caribbean men, maybe in the diaspora back home, who are trying to understand, where all of these lineages of alcoholism come from, if they're looking at their dad or their grandfathers or their uncles, to really understand how much of it was embedded in the history, and not to use that as an excuse for the behavior, but as a way to understand kind of where those issues came from and how they use that information to perhaps have conversations with, their uncles and their dads about generations before them and what they learned and what they were taught and what they experienced. And I think for me, one of the things that I always saw, like, culture is really being held by the women in my family. So I always looked more for, talking to women of all ages. And one of the things that I didn't start until recently was interviewing men and figuring out what was the behavior that you saw from your dad and your uncles and your grandfathers? How did you deal or cope with domestic violence if you had a father who was abusive towards your mother? Was there any conversation about you not wanting to replicate that for future generations or your own children? And I've had a really interesting experience talking to a lot of guys. I've talked to some men who are in their 80s, one man who's 90, and hearing their perspective and, hearing about what they grew up with and how it was just so common to have, a dad that would hit their mom, or a dad who was abusive towards them, or a dad who was an alcoholic or had a gambling addiction. And it never being called out, kind of just being more of a joke because it was so common. I think getting that perspective really, really helped me understand more about, how these issues continue to be replicated in every cycle, because there is, at least for us, there hasn't really been any attempt to try and have a long-term fix for it, right? We've only, at least in my experience, seen very band-aid solutions. But I think as we learn more and try to spread more information, that's how we try to, tackle it in a better way.
Mm-hmm. And Omesh says alcohol is celebrated in popular modern chutney songs, but that doesn't help. And yeah, a lot of things that we do and are part of our culture, unfortunately, sort of ends up making us feel like there's no other way, or it's the way it's supposed to be.
Well, I ended up deciding I don't drink alcohol, and I never really have. And I think a huge, obviously I've only had, this one life, so who knows the decisions I would have made if I grew up in a different circumstance. But I think just kind of seeing the over excess of alcohol in the community, or how much of every kind of social interaction it was a part of, I just ended up deciding not to drink. And I think a huge, reason for that was just kind of seeing the not wanting to be like a belligerent Indo-Caribbean man, or like the stereotype of that. Even though it's a stereotype, it is very much true because of the rates of alcoholism, as we said, which are very high. And I'm lucky that I never saw that with my dad. My dad is like a very calm, very quiet man. But I think seeing it in my friends and the men in their family, and one of the things that I never really was exposed to a lot with things like soca music or carnival and stuff like that, because My family noticed this thing in our local community here where from the age of like 15, 16, a lot of my Indo-Caribbean friends, that were when they were starting to drink, starting to lime, starting to fet, and they kind of kept us away from that a little bit because they saw that being a very unhealthy social conditioning, like children drinking with their elders in their family or their parents or their aunts and uncles and doing it with their friends and it becoming a very ingrained behavior at such a young age and as
Mm-hmm.
music and all of that. So I think for me, seeing the excess of it and seeing the way that my parents really separated themselves from that, that ended up, leading me to make that decision for myself. So yeah, that's, I think if we're talking about Corrales, then that would probably be an interesting perspective there.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of your parents, Corrales, and so, they intentionally, I think, didn't want you to grow up in that stereotype, and so that's the potential now, right? This is the potential now for some of us who are raising young boys or teenagers, and of course, I think it's um, there's a probably a healthy balance of associating and being part of the feds and going to Carnival and celebrating that aspect of culture without it becoming a lifestyle.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read some of these. So the Unreal Joel says young people back home are more educated, have access to more information. I have high hopes for them. Oh, that's so great to hear. Stephanie says seeking support for our mental health is not a sign of weakness, but strength to better ourselves, both men and women in this discussion. You are not alone. Oh, thank you so much for that, Steph. I think we can find a balance with alcohol, and every culture has a way with it. Yeah, that's what the Unreal Joel said. And Simone agreed. And Steph said, from the perspective of an older generation may not believe in mental health, it's just in your head. Pull yourself together. Yeah, let me tell you, it's a real thing. Don't feel shame for getting help. Yes, yes. Sonia says that's a good point. I grew up seeing a lot of my uncles being alcoholics. Yeah, and I think it's one of those really tricky things. It's like if you see it so much, it kind of repels you, and so. But if you see it so much, you start to internalize it. So I guess it's the way in which you end up going. I I don't know. The Unreal Joel says the British introduced alcohol to India to use as a tool for dominating. Yeah, okay. So that's one of the things I really wanted to touch on. So I'm gonna get back to that. Don says, we can choose to break the cycles. My father eased up on his drinking when I was born, and I choose not to be the stereotypical Indo-Caribbean male because I saw firsthand the negative impacts growing up. And Suana says, my dad still doesn't understand my struggle with mental health. Yeah, and so I think this is what's resonating with me at the moment when it comes to alcoholism in the society and in the culture is once you know the history, you know that it was a tool in which the British did intentionally place these rum shops in the estates to sort of kind of use it as cheap pleasure for the men, right? To just continue to work, to just stay focused and to not deviate too far away from task on hand, right? Because that's what alcohol does, right? It just gives you this illusion that everything's fine, and you go to work, you come home, you drink, you sleep, you wake up, you walk, you drink, and you just do it every day, right? And so it really was this tool, in my opinion, of oppression and suppression of hopes and dreams. And I wonder if men really, really thought about that, if the Indo-Caribbean men really thought about that for a second and was like, look, this is intentional, right? This was intentional. These rum shops were here. My grandparents or my great grandparents, he drank when he came home and he went to work, and he did it over and over again. And then so my father did the same thing. And then, you see it playing out, and you're kind of wondering like, oh, that is really not a good history, and like so unfair. And I think many Indo-Caribbean men, I don't want to speak for them, but I would wonder if they still feel this way of stuckness, the way that, some of our ancestors might have felt of, there's no other way. Because I do think alcohol kind of just like oppresses you in a way that you don't feel there's any other way to live, right? And so how much of that, 200 years ago is still now, right? How many Indo-Caribbean men now still feel like there's no other way? And we see it from the suicide rates, right, in certain places. And so, I mean, that's what I would really, if I was a man, I would really think about. I would really, really think about is, that was used as a tool to strip me away from everything that I could potentially have. And so then it's a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's a choice.
And I mean, when you think about how young Indo-Caribbean men are socialized, how they develop their relationships with other men in their family, oftentimes it is through liming, right? So you start off with one beer, you might end up, graduating to two, to three, to more. And that ends up becoming like the thing that you do when you're becoming a young Indo-Caribbean man, learning from other, Indo-Caribbean men growing up. And so I don't know a lot of Indo-Caribbean men that go for like a walk in the park with their uncles and have a discussion, right? It's usually they drink a little bit and they have a chat. And that is kind of that liming culture there. That's kind of like how they grow up. That's how they socialize. That's how they learn to be Indo-Caribbean men. The behaviors and the ideas that they see expressed in that situation that is fueled by alcohol are informing a lot of their worldviews.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that it's definitely something that needs to be talked more about because, alcohol is a very social thing. So if people are using it all the time while they're socializing, it's having a direct effect on behavior and how you learn to be a part of the community.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's really alcohol is really and the act of drinking alcohol is really celebrated, which is interesting. And so, from my experience, my dad he isn't a big drinker. He used to drink, and now he's getting older, so he doesn't really care to drink too much. But what I will say is that there is a healthy way to consume alcohol.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's all pause on that for a second to realize that there is a healthy way to consume alcohol, and there are healthy ways to build connection with your brothers and with your family and with your uncles that don't necessarily need to revolve around drinking, right? And I think it's us considering some of those options of what that could be. One of the things that especially as my family at least, we did a lot of camping trips, we did a lot of beach trips, and so of course they would bring alcohol, but there were activities to do, right? There were things that we threw ball around, we played cricket, we did all these things, right? And so if there's anybody listening, if we don't need to get to the point where it's like, okay, we need to ban alcohol, right? There is a way of drinking healthy alcohol, having alcohol in a healthy way that doesn't perpetuate mental health issues and physical issues, of course. So there are possibilities, and I think it's a matter of us not really seeing it represented in our community, like you were saying about walks in the park and these types of things. And it's like, now with our generation of my sister has have kids, so now we make it a point to have a lot of family picnics, go for a lot of hikes. And so it's interesting because we started this we started this in our family, and some of the uncles and some of the cousins that were big drinkers are coming on board. They're coming for the hikes, they're doing these things that we like to do. And so I just want to put it out there that there's another way and it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see what's going on here. Okay, so Sonia says my dad still doesn't understand my struggle with mental health. Yep. It's really good to see how this topic of mental health is important to bridge the generational gap on these topics. I'm glad to see that more people are bringing this out in the open. Yes, yes. Simone said, I learned recently that Indo-Caribbean male laborers were compensated with rum for wages, sometimes on the plantations by the British. And so there you go, right? And so once it becomes an addiction, there's like no way somebody's not gonna say, no, I won't take that rum. Right? Like, honestly. Okay, so Omir says it's traumatic. Imagine being a little child and seeing your dad hitting your mom. Yes, yes, yes. Suana says, seeing how I grew up watching my uncles drink so much, I almost fell into a trap of using alcohol as a coping mechanism for my anxiety. The only reason why I didn't completely fall into that cycle is because I realized that I am stronger than that, and what I see is not always right. And so let's drive that point home a little bit, is that, we know, psychology 101 is we see things and we internalize it and then we act it out unconsciously, right? And so just knowing that what we see, just having that awareness, like what we see isn't always right, can be really liberating. Because I hear some conversations around, oh, my dad did it. Mm-hmm. So what's the problem? We have a lot. Thank you guys so much for being in the comments. So appreciated. So Suana said, I never had a support system growing up, and seeing alcohol so commonly used almost made it present itself as a solution. Yeah, exactly. Vanessa says, it all starts with giving children a taste of alcohol. It's something that has always irked me. It's interesting because alcohol is like so embedded in so many things that we do. And it's one of the things that I've seen, it doesn't happen in my family, but what I've seen in many other families is like, if you're hungry, if you're not hungry, but you're supposed to eat, you can take a shot of alcohol to open up your appetite. Like that's how much we like integrate alcohol into our lives. The Unreal Joel says, Italians give their kids a taste of wine at the table, yet they have very low alcoholism and tea and alcohol abuse. I think the issue is with the ego, when it's used as an escape to cope, and when it ends up using you. Yeah, and I think it goes back to one of the things that I don't know, it's really important for me, Vinay, to have all, like, my sisters having kids, to sort of have them see the potential of something else, right? And I lost my train of thought. And to see them, I remember now, to see other men, and to see even women, because some men can still, internalize some of the things that they see growing up with their mothers too, and find ways, but giving them other options as coping mechanisms. And I think, to be honest, I think a big part of our population is still learning that for ourselves right now. Mm-hmm. Right? We're still learning how to cope with the stress that we have, our everyday stress. And so the hope is we become more and more educated. And if there's anybody on the live right now that have children, know that it's possible to break cycles by just, modeling some better behavior. And so that's the hope. Any other thing you want to say about alcoholism or anything like that? Any last thoughts?
Like the breaking of these cycles, if you think about the fact that indentureship ended, about 100 years ago now, think about the leaps and bounds we've made since then. Obviously, we still have a lot of issues, but when I think about the relationship I have with my parents versus the ones that they had with their mom and dad, I can see a huge amount of progress there. And so I think it's always very good to be optimistic about, what to hope for the next generation moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting point that you just made. It's, a big thing for me, particularly growing up, was my relationship with my dad. I had a really strong relationship with him. And so I think we underestimate the power of just having a really good relationship with our parents as a form of support in terms of our mental health or whatever it is that we're struggling with. So I'm glad to see that there are ways in which we can tackle it from so many different angles, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit, and so we just talked about some of our Karilas. Any other Karilas you want to bring up? We brought up colorism. Anything from a male perspective that's like, I'm just gonna put this down.
Well, I think the reason why I brought up the alcoholism, I think, came from the male perspective of seeing how alcoholism is tied in so much with Indo-Caribbean masculinity and how I, growing up didn't want to be attached to that. So I think for me, that was probably the one that came from that kind of gendered perspective there.
And I thank you so much for bringing it up, because I think it's important that um, a male brings it up, because I don't think we underestimate the power of, and I think I'm going to go into this conversation, which is the power of male and male conversation, right? And I think us women, I think, are pretty strong-willed these days, especially some of us, us modern women. We have a lot of opinions and a lot of solutions, right? And so, of course, we can bring this forth in our families. And one of the things that I would really love to see in our community is men talking about these issues with each other, sharing ideas of how to better cope, creating bonds that are more that are deeper than just sharing of alcohol. Share what's going on with you, share what's, a lot of men struggle because they don't have anyone, they feel like they don't have anyone to talk to, and they over rely on some of the women in their lives. And so it's very possible to have, intimate relationships, not, with your brothers, and to share emotional stuff, and to have these types of conversations with each other, because I think that's super, super important. And I would just love to see some more advocacy from men to men around mental health in the Indo-Caribbean community. So if there's anyone out here that's listening to me and I just sparked a idea there for you, it was a big task, but the more we have some of these discussions, I think the better. And I'm glad you brought up alcoholism. So thank you so much, Vinay. Oh, and the other thing I just wanted to share from a female perspective is just remembering for my women out there, that we are not those men's therapists, right? We are not those men's, their trauma are not ours to kind of fix and manage and hold. And of course, as partners, if we have partners, if we have dads, we have uncles, we have brothers, sisters, for sure, of course, we're going to be there to support them. And I would just say that is an issue, I think, for any person that's struggling with mental health. I think it's there's a tricky line, or a really safe line, where you're supportive versus taking it on, right? Because then you're gonna sacrifice your mental health, and then there's two people in the relationship, whether partnership, father, daughter, whatever the case may be, that are struggling with their mental health. So lastly, I just want to say, I feel called to just say, if anyone else is struggling with alcoholism or mental health, please get the support that you need, okay? Okay, so switching gears. So part of the story, Corella, was also around this idea of preservation, sending the recipes and giving it to her daughter. And so I'm wondering from you, you obviously have the Cutlass, you're doing a lot of preservation around Indo-Caribbean identity and culture, so thank you, of course, for that. I'm wondering from you specifically, getting to know you a little better in your day-to-day, how are you preserving Indo-Caribbean identity and history and culture?
Day to day, well, one of the things I always do is play music, just because that's the way I grew up. There's always music playing, whether it's, Bollywood music from the 50s and 60s to the 90s, or nowadays to modern chutney music, or even traditional classical chutney music, stuff like that. So I always play music every day, and little family traditions like, lighting your diya at 6 o'clock and agarbatti and little things like that. Having those rituals, I think, can be very grounding and give you a routine, and it reminds you of things that people have been doing for generations now. And yeah, and every day I pretty much try and read and study and do a bit of research. With my archival project, I'm frequently talking to, elders in the community and finding out their stories and trying to document and preserve it as much as I can. And as people know with the Cutlass, I'm often trying to come up with content and stuff for that. So for me, I think Indo-Caribbean identity and Indo-Caribbean culture is such a huge part of who I am, whether it's the food that I like to eat or the music that I play or the books that I read. Um, and for me, the reason why I started the platform in the first place was because I think that a lot of times Indo-Caribbean culture gets diluted to or boiled down essentially to people saying, chutney, soca, carnival, doubles, and that's it. And I think the started the platform was to really show just how rich and diverse it is and how much history is there, how much history has been documented. Even, doing the language posts, I've had so many people reach out to me and say, I thought that that was a made up word. I thought that, it's just my family nonsense. And I had to tell them, no, those are actual words that are sometimes so old that South Asian people might not even know it because it is so specific to our dialect and our linguistic roots. And yeah, even things like speaking in the accent, speaking in the dialect, preserving the language. The language is a really huge thing for me. So I think it is such a huge part of who I am, and I wouldn't really consider it to be, reclaiming Indo-Caribbean culture because I think since I never had that phase where I tried to distance from it, I think it's more of just me actively trying to learn more so that I can help other people or pass on more information and just being more purposeful about it.
And I think, that's one of the things that I think is really great about your experience with Indo-Caribbean culture is that it kind of never left you. And so here you are with this, with this wealth of knowledge. A lot of people, they don't have the opportunity, myself included, to speak to their grandparents or to kind of be so immersed in it. And so I'm glad that you are doing what you're doing because a lot of us are now benefiting from this reclamation of identity and culture that we now have access to the information that we otherwise wouldn't have. And so if there's anyone watching here, I'm sure that you know this already, but Vinay this is his passion. It's a passion project. No one's like, Vinay, do this post and I'm gonna, give you X. I'm gonna give you rum, so Vinay is getting nothing out of this except for all of the community, which is of course amazing. Perk. And I just want to let everyone know that Vinay's GoFundMe is in our link in our bio. So please, if any way that you can support him, I personally would not be the Indo-Caribbean woman I am without your posts, Vinay. So if there's anybody out there that you can, you have something to spare, don't hesitate to support Vinay and all the work that he does. He does the work that all of us don't necessarily want to do, but we want the benefit of seeing the posts and knowing. And one of the things I always, Vinay, when I read your post about music, so here's how you've impacted me, okay? So when I read your posts on music, now I don't know whether to dance or not to this song because now I know what it's about. Now I have this aversion to, oh my God, I know it's about this man beating this woman now. How am I supposed to act? So I'm at this place right now, I don't know how to act when certain things come on. And so I'm sure I will be fine and I'll figure it out. But that's one of the personal ways that your work has impacted me. So thank you again so much for all the work that you do.
Yeah, I was actually hesitant to translate these songs for that very reason because I didn't want anyone to be disappointed, but I hope that what I'm trying to do is show that a lot of these times these songs were used as narratives, right? Were talking about cultural issues. They wrote songs about violence because it was an issue plaguing the community, and a way for them to address it was to sing about it, to talk about it. And whenever you see there's even the Rat Ke Sapna song by Sundar Popa that I translated recently, that one has to do with identity and having to, without access to resources, pass on information or create a family with kind of support. So a lot of these songs, they have a narrative to them that are very true to Indo-Caribbean tradition, where people sang these things as a way to address the problem. They didn't have platforms, they didn't have resources, so the way that they brought, attention to it was through song and through music and to dance. And oftentimes they would be singing these songs in very communal settings and people would be dancing. You think of the Machikor and the kind of songs that women would sing there. I'm still wondering how I'm going to translate those songs because they're highly suggestive. Um, it's important for people to know that the themes of these songs are very heavy, but if you're feeling conflicted about, dancing to it or singing along to it, just know that them writing music about it was their form of coping, their form of addressing it, their form of teaching their children about abuse in families or alcoholism in families or even, I've come across songs where, um, it's songs that women would sing to young daughters who they were like preparing her for a life of potential hardship, having to get married and go to a different family. So a lot of those songs come from a good place, and I think unfortunately, because of the loss of language, people kind of didn't know the context of them. But I think it's important that, don't feel bad for dancing to them. A lot of these songs, like I think it's uh, now I'm forgetting it. The Lalana Kuse song, by Sam Bujram. That's a song that would be sung for when babies are born. But a lot of times now people, sing and they dance and they fet it and they drink and all of that, even though the song has very religious undertones. And I think it's important to kind of marry the notion of what was this song originally, what did it intend to mean, and how have we now held on to it as a form of cultural preservation because we lacked so many opportunities to learn the language ourselves. And I think that's kind of a fine balance to strike of, okay, you can listen to this music, you can dance to this music, but you should at least know what it is about. And my hope with learning the language and with trying to spread more information about the language is so that we can eventually get more music, original music, not, just covers and remixes and all of that, and be able to have good music with the lyrics that people can actually dance to and not feel any kind of hesitancy.
Yeah, and to be fair, there's music coming out in 2020 that have the same undertones, right? So I think it's one of those things that it can exist together where we now know, the meaning of some of these songs, and we can hopefully figure out our own way of how we want to navigate dancing, not dancing, celebrating, not celebrating some of these songs. And it's really interesting to think about how the loss of language really perpetuated this, like, almost, I don't want to call it ignorance, but it's kind of ignorance of like the meanings behind some of these songs and what they were meant to be for. And so again, is one of the reasons why your platform is so important, because how else do we know these things? Some of our parents don't know these things. And so I think it's I will always sing your praises. So thank you again for all that you do in terms of that. And I know one of the things that you do in terms of preserving culture is through language. So you taught yourself Bhojpuri, I think it is. And so do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Like how did you do that?
I started through standard Hindi, so I started learning Hindi, and there are a lot of books. I often recommend the Rupert Snell and R.S. McGregor books. Those are good for people starting from an English language kind of basis. And I was very fortunate to have grown up hearing a lot of the Hindustani words from my family members. So knowing words like, Pushpisawe or Janjat or Pugli or stuff like that. I always heard those words growing up. So when I started learning standard Hindi, and it was all self-taught, and I started teaching my sister as well, uh, I started incorporating kind of the phrases and the words that I also heard growing up. And so that was a way for me to kind of get an in. And as I started learning, looking into the songs and translating and figuring out what these words mean and these themes that keep coming up and these phrases and doing my archival work with the elder generation, that's how I started learning more of the Trinidad poetry, our more local dialect. And it's very interesting because they are very different, but whenever I talk to the elders in the community, they always refer to it as broken Hindi. And that's another, stereotype that we were kind of taught to believe, that the language we spoke was very broken, or it was the language of the illiterate, the low class, the low caste, and that's not true at all. It's a very beautiful language, and it was just very specific to the region that we came from. So sometimes I'll talk like the older people, and I'll start off and I'll say like Hamanga Hindustani mein, and then they're always very, that means I want to talk in Hindi, and they're always very taken aback to see like a young guy who knows the language, because some of them, they told me like they haven't spoken the language in maybe 50 years because everyone that they know has passed away already. So I speak to them and it kind of immediately sends them, down a memory lane to when they were younger. And it's a really interesting experience. And I think that I'm very fortunate that I can get access to a lot of information that way, because I can kind of relate to them on that front and understand what they're saying. And so my hope is to eventually help revive it so that anyone who wants to learn can learn. And I often think about like 50, 60 years down the line, maybe there will be a little group of people who can still speak it, are writing music in it. Someone wants to study it, they get in contact with a child of mine or niece or nephew or someone in my family, and they can learn all about it. That's kind of my long-term goal, because I think for me, language and Hindustani, Indian Creole are all things that I really want to preserve. And I know it's difficult, but that's kind of my goal, in helping to incorporate it more into schools, into cultural programs, into Indo-Caribbean studies, have it standardized for there to be a curriculum, books, all of that stuff. So yeah, I want to definitely make sure that even if, not, I'm very doubtful that everyone is going to learn how to speak it, but if we can at least preserve it from language death, I think we would be able to hold on to more of our culture, more of an appreciation for the older music, perhaps have new music, and I think it would be very beneficial in the long term.
Can you imagine like having some of the new songs come out with some of the lyrics that we used to have, or the language we used to have? That would be amazing. And I really feel your vision, Vinay. I really hope that is something that we can do. And so keep letting us know how we can support you. That sounds like it's not a one-man job. So please reach out for support and let us know in any way how we can help you right now, whether it's and it's really interesting because I talked to my sister the other day, and so because I'm I follow you and I know now about some of these words, I always felt like it was a language. Like I didn't think they were like making it up. But I told my sister, and she was like, no, those are just like made up words. I'm like, no, sis, it's not a made up word. It's actually a language. And so, and she's older than I am. So, I mean, like, I think one of the things is I hear a lot is that some of these words are made up, and just knowing that they're not sparks some curiosity, I think. And it's one of the ways too that I think all of us can preserve cultures through words and through language. And I mean, even if you're not studying the language, even incorporating, I try to incorporate some of these words like pagli and all the things that I grew up my mom calling me to preserve and its form of endearment. But that's one of the ways that I think we can all sort of we can hang on to our culture in some way, knowing these words. And so again, of course, thank you so much for sharing. And so I know you shared this vision of how you want to preserve language. Anything else like for you in terms of Indo-Caribbean identity that you're like really passionate about preserving in your family, you see yourself 10 years from now still
I'm
doing?
honest. For me, I really do think it's kind of everything because I I feel like we're very fortunate to be a position where we don't necessarily have to maybe pick and choose. We still do and we still can, but it's not on the basis of survival the way it would have been, for previous generations. It's not that dire. It's more based on, freedom and choice. And I think for me, I really enjoy all of the different aspects about it, whether it is the language or aspects of the religion or the clothes or all of that stuff. Like I have my collection of Indo-Caribbean books, and I was hoping to put my bookshelf together that I maybe would have showed, but I didn't get a chance to. So all of my books are kind of very puha right now. So I'm not, but yeah,
Well, next time, it's a reason for us to do this again. Show us your bookshelf.
I so like I often say again, like how I mentioned with the language, I imagine some kind of reality, 50 years down the line where someone goes, man, I really wish I had that one last copy of that book, and someone in my family will be able to be like, oh well, my mamu or my aja preserved, that being me, and give that book, or vinyl from my uncle because I have some chutney vinyls and stuff like that. So even like being able to pass that stuff down. Uh,
Amazing.
yeah, the food, the music, the clothes, the religion, the language. Even if my children are the one, two, three, however many they are, the only people in the world that end up speaking Trinidad poetry, I'll be happy for that?
Right. And so I have an interesting question for you. So what if you're having children now? You have, two children, and none of them is interested in learning anything Indo-Caribbean. How are you handling that?
One of the things I'm kind of testing it out with the page, trying to make it very fun, right? So when I do
Yeah.
quizzes or I do the posts, I try to inject a bit of, my sense of humor in there because I think people would agree that the page is not very serious. The content and the information is substantial, but I try to make it fun. I think I'll use a lot of that on them,
Yeah.
um, bribe them in certain ways. But yeah, no, I think I'm struggling between whether I'll be that person, whether it's for my own kids and nieces or nephews, be that person who's like, sit down for half an hour and you're going to read this. If,
I know. I think that's a struggle we're all gonna face. Is like read this or eat this. Make sure you like this, like this. No, we're all gonna have to figure out our own parenting strategies here, and gamifying it is a great strategy.
I think perhaps a good thing to pass on would be a sense of cultural pride.
Mm.
Parents who are very proud of where they came from and what they come from and their story and are knowledgeable. And for me, a lot of the things that I learned or started learning, they weren't from textbooks. They were from, when my relatives had come from Trinidad and opened those 3 suitcases that were dedicated to food and clothes and all the stuff that they brought, or even like sitting in the back and having tea and listening to everyone talk and or even things like, going into a roti shop and knowing how to order my food and listening conversations people are having. It doesn't have to be confined to textbooks and very, serious panels and all of that. You can make it fun and you can make it digestible and I think palatable in a way that children would be, interested in. So I to do that and hopefully show other people how they can do that.
Yeah, and I think with you having it a part of your home and how you live on a day to day is really will be for all of us really impactful. And I was gonna say something else that was gonna be helpful, but I lost it. So, but yeah. So, in terms of food, tell me a little bit about your some of your favorite Indo-Caribbean foods.
I think for me, my favorites will always be like chana and aloo, pumpkin, dal puri, curry chicken, and all of the various mithais, like these sweets, kurma, mohan bhog, lapsi, all of that stuff. Barfi, jalebi, things like that. I wouldn't say that I have a favorite. I think there are times when like you just know that like bhaji and dal and rice is perfect. So I don't have a favorite. I just really love all of it, and I'm very
Fan.
fortunate. I've been in a family with really great cooks, so I don't have a favorite, but that's definitely one of the things I would pass on.
And so tell me a little bit about your role as far as, because we know traditionally women were a big, we're a big part of the family in terms of making meals and stuff. So what's your vision for yourself as far as your family is concerned when it comes to being in the kitchen?
Well, I think one of the good things about if we're going back to gender, like me, even though as I mentioned, I'm not like a very public face of the platform, one of the good things I think about me being a guy kind of doing this is showing that traditionally, as you mentioned, culture would often be passed down through the men. And I think moving forward, having culture being framed as this thing that is passed down equally by partners, because whether you have a mom or a dad or two dads, two moms, or you have a single parent but a very close relationship to an aunt or uncle, I think it's important for people to know that culture is everyone's responsibility, and we all have our strengths. I don't foresee my strength being cooking. However, I do know that I could probably add to that conversation, you know? So in terms of right now, I definitely would say I'm a good assistant in a kitchen. I'm maybe not a good primary cook, but it is a goal of mine to get better than that. But I'm kind of developing, other skills, and then I'll kind of go into that one because I don't want to be useless in that regard. Like my mom taught my dad how to cook when they got married because she very much wanted him to contribute in that way. And for me, seeing a dad who could cook and make a big pot of pilau or egg and aloo and all of that stuff, it was maybe at the time I didn't realize it, but it was impactful. So I definitely want to continue that, moving forward.
Yeah, and I think it's really it is nice to see when it's a shared, a shared activity with men and women. My parents were the same way too, where they cooked together, and it wasn't just the responsibility of the female. And so, good on you. And so you'll get there. Start with China. China is super easy. You start small, but you'll have to find time with all the other preservation projects that you're doing. And I have one last question for you in terms of, well, before I have one last question for you, anything else you want to say regarding preservation? Anything you want to let us know in terms of like how we can better preserve? Any advice? Anything you want to share about preservation of Indo-Caribbean culture?
Um, I always I always tell people to have conversations with people in their family. It doesn't have to be only older people, but even people their age to kind of figure out how everyone relates to their identity and how they make sense of it. Um, but when it does come to older people, I do encourage people to just sit down, have a conversation, and record it. And
Yeah.
you get gems from that conversation that can take you on for, the rest of your life. Even with my archival project, where I'm talking to people in their 80s to their 90s, they give me so much, whether or not they're aware of it or not, so much advice and so many stories that really kind of energized me and I think sustained this interest that I have in preservation. So definitely look towards it, people in your family, ask questions, continue asking because maybe in the beginning people might not be so open to it in the very start, but it's a very good way to build a relationship. And I do often tell people that one of the tough things that I've had to come to terms with is that one of the very natural processes in the world is that you do lose things with time. So you can't preserve everything. And I had to come to a place where I was okay with that, where I really felt like this thing is gone and will we ever be able to bring it back? But I think just kind of knowing that the natural order of things is that people change and they evolve with time. So you might not be able to bring back or preserve everything that you want, but as soon as you make peace with the fact that there's, a limited amount that you can do, just focus on that. and it can be in a small way, but you'll play a huge role in the community overall. So you don't need to start a platform, you don't need to launch a brand or anything like that. You can preserve in very small ways that are definitely impactful, because a lot of my work relies on people who just happen to keep a book from their grandparent, or just happen to keep a recipe, or just happen to ask a question one time that led to a story that they've now passed on to me. So a lot of it is very valuable.
Going back to some of having those conversations, I mean, we always think we have a lot of time to have these conversations, but sometimes we don't. So we encourage everyone to have these conversations, record them. One of the things that I've learned with my grandma, for example, is that they love to talk. They want to share these stories with us, and so give them the time. You won't regret it. It's like you get transported into a different way. You get so you end up getting so curious about so much just hearing one story. So I definitely encourage everyone to talk to their whoever's here, can tell you whatever stories that they still have. One of the things that I do want to share too is that in terms of recipes, because we're all about food here, is that one of the things that I've noticed is every family cooks a little different. And so I would encourage everyone to, if you enjoy a dish from your parents, to really get that recipe, because what we'll find, there's lots of platforms right now that you can access some of the Indo-Caribbean recipes. Sometimes they're just a little bit off, and we know for ourselves it's not off because it's a wrong recipe, but it's off because it's just not the same way that our family cooked it and our mom cooked it. And sometimes it's just, a little bit more onions or excluding this, and so it's like it's such a small thing that they do that's different, but it changes the taste. And I don't want to scare anyone, but I mean, you could be like searching forever for that taste, so get those recipes from your family, especially if there's a dish that you really love, because there's no guarantee that you'll get that same taste. But with that being said, there's a lot of great accounts that are sharing recipes right now, and part of the preservation of food. So that's what I just wanted to say about recipes. And so my last question for you, Vinay, is going back to the conversation around being an Indo-Caribbean man and navigating this space. And so we talked a little bit about alcohol and mental health, and maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of if there are any men right now that are listening that will watch this that are struggling with identity, struggling with the nuances of what it means to be a man in the Indo-Caribbean community, maybe struggling with the idea of masculinity, is there anything that you would like to say or share that could help them from your experience?
Well, in terms of struggling with masculinity, I think for me, I grew up predominantly around women. Like I never really had a lot of male friends, or I was very kind of socialized predominantly around Indo-Caribbean women, and then that led to friendships and relationships later on where most of my social circle oftentimes would be women. And so one thing I often tell men is that masculinity isn't like a standardized thing. It's very fluid, and people have their own definitions of what masculinity is. I know a lot of men see, having a beer or having a drink with another man in their family and having a lime or something is very key to their, masculinity and who they are as men. And for me, it's different. So I often tell people that there is no one thing or one way to be a man. When it comes to, I do notice that a lot of Indo-Caribbean men sometimes see like Indian things as being like emasculating. So like identifying a lot as, or demasculating, identifying a lot with like Bollywood or chutney music, or really loving to like wear Indian clothes, or sometimes make the food, stuff like that. I've had a lot of guys tell me that an Indian guy is not a cool thing in like the wider social conversation, right? Like, I think definitely in the United States or Canada or the UK, for a lot of people in the diaspora, there are a lot of perceptions towards Asian men or Indian men where they're not considered masculine or they're not considered very cool and things like that. So I often tell people that masculinity is your own to define, and you don't need to compare to someone else's, how they measure it or how they make sense of it. And so just kind of whatever makes you feel comfortable and gives you very successful and substantial relationships with men and women and friendships, and you don't feel like this idea of masculinity is preventing you from seeking help for mental illness or from living a happy life, then it seems like it's working, and that's a good thing and that's a positive. So yeah, I often tell guys that like lean into the things that make you happy and make you comfortable and give you good, healthy relationships.
And I think that's one of the things that we touched on in our last conversation with some of the writers too, is that there's no one way to be Indo-Caribbean, and that includes being an Indo-Caribbean man. And so whatever future you want for yourself, whether that's with or without alcohol, in a reasonable way, and it's all possible, I think, is one of the things that I think came up in this conversation between us. And so I just want to reiterate that it's possible to create the life that you want as an Indo-Caribbean man in whatever way that makes you feel like you're attaining your vision for yourself as a person, So, Vinay, thank you so much. Before we close off, is there anything else you want to say? Anything you want to share?
I guess I would just say that thank you for obviously, having me on and having this conversation with me. I think sometimes it's hard for me to kind of gauge whether or not the platform is having like an impact, because it is so difficult to know what people think or if they do kind of respond to the content or material. So I'm always very happy and very appreciative to be invited onto things like this, because it does feel then that people are responding and they are paying attention. And like sometimes I've had people reach out to me and ask me to like have a meeting with my social media coordinator, my content producer, and have to be like, that's just to me. I'm just like trying to figure all of this out. So I do like take this platform very personally, since it's very much just myself. So I always am very grateful whenever people reach out and tell me that they appreciate some of the posts. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for all the work that you do. Again, anybody that's here and will watch this, there's a link in our bio right now to support Cutlass and all the wonderful work that he does. Don't underestimate the support that you can give. So please do check that out. And I think it always surprises me, Vinay, that you think that your platform isn't making an impact.
It's just so difficult to know. Maybe because I'm not like not very good at social media. I'm still kind of trying to figure it out. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a way to find out or to know, but I'm still working on that.
Let's all tell after this live. Let's all tell Vinay how significant the work he is that he's doing, and how important it is, and how much impact it has. Please, I think that's something for us all to remember, is to share our appreciation for the people doing some of the work that they're doing in terms of preservation. Mm-hmm. But thank you all. Let me just see if there's anything that anyone has to say here. Stephanie says, thank you both so much for this great discussion. It's truly helpful in bringing awareness and changing those corrales. Thank you so much, Steph. Lisa says, Cutlass is amazing and so insightful. Yes, keep the comments coming in. But yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us. I hope that some of these conversations at least will help us think a little bit about being more intentional about how we show up as Indo-Caribbean people, how we take on the responsibility of preserving and of passing down some of who we are. A lot of us in the diaspora have been told a story around assimilation. And so I hope these conversations are helpful. I hope you guys and everyone enjoyed listening to Vinay and all of his expertise and his personal experience. It was great, Vinay, to get to know you a little bit better. And I hope that all of these grand visions you have around preservation come to be. I'm setting that intention for you myself. And if there's any way any of us can support you, always please let us know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And likewise.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming and watching.
Bye.